All right, well, you'd be happy to know that I've accounted for the fact that, this is a longer service. We've had communion, we have church lunch afterwards, and so this might be the shortest sermon you're ever going to hear from me anyway. Don't get used to it. It's just a one-off on these kind of Sundays. But this morning we're going to start wrapping up this sermon series we've been looking at on the whole armor of God. We're in Ephesians chapter 6. We've been there for a couple of months now, just looking at the whole armor of God. We've looked at, as you might know, things like the belt of truth. What comes next? The breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of gospel peace, the swords coming up, Chrisanne. That's two more next up. The shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And we've seen how each one of these pieces of armor have been given to us by God as spiritual protection against the powerful forces of evil, against the clever schemes and tactics of Satan. If you've missed any of these sermons in the series, I'd encourage you, they're all on our Spotify page. You can go to our YouTube page. I'd encourage you to catch up on those. Why? So that you too can get yourself equipped with each piece of God's armor available to you. But now today, we come to that last piece of the armor on Paul's list. Another powerful weapon in the hands of every Christian soldier. And this one is just as powerful, perhaps even more powerful at times, than the ones who have come before it. You see, here's what's interesting about this piece of the armor. It's often ignored, actually, as being part of the armor. Perhaps not even considered part of the armor at times. You know why? Because Paul doesn't have a parallel piece of the soldier's armor to compare it with, right? Like with the truth, he compares it to the soldier's belt. With righteousness, the soldier's breastplate. The word of God, the soldier's sword. But with this piece of the armor, there's no parallel piece that Paul compares it to. And it's not because Paul had run out of pieces of armor that the soldiers used back then to compare it. I mean, Roman soldiers had plenty of other weapons they used in warfare, like spears, bows and arrows. They even had a battering ram kind of thing back then, a catapult. Sometimes horses would be trained and used as a weapon. And so the question is, why doesn't Paul use any of these other weapons to compare this last spiritual weapon with? Now, this is only speculation here, okay? Only speculation, so I warn you. But here's what I think. Here's what I reckon. I think Paul doesn't use any of the remaining weapons available as a parallel to this last spiritual weapon because none of them come even close to the power and to the precision and to the effectiveness of this last weapon on Paul's list. So perhaps we can think about it like this then. Since Paul doesn't give us a specific piece of battle gear to equate this last one to, perhaps we can view this last piece of the armor as kind of like a secret weapon. You know how armies and militaries, they're always trying to get the upper hand against their enemies by creating and designing new and improved weapons? Well, this weapon is like that. Because this weapon is something that the enemy does not have. And more importantly, it's a weapon that the enemy cannot stop. There is no defense for this type of weapon. And so what is this weapon we keep talking about? What is this last piece of the armor? Well, how about we read it for ourselves? Ephesians 6:18 says, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. Prayer is a weapon that the devil doesn't have access to. And prayer is a weapon that the devil cannot stop. He has no defense against it. Here's a bit more speculation for you in case I haven't given you enough already. You see, if Paul were writing the book of Ephesians today, and comparing our pieces of spiritual armor to the type of weapons used in modern warfare and to the weapons we have available today, well, I think there may be a weapon that prayer could be compared to. And this weapon is a perfect example of this last piece of spiritual armor. Here's a hint to show you where I'm going with this. Does anyone know what the most successful, highest earning movie of 2022 was? Anyone remember? Any guesses? That's just a couple of years ago. Think big budget. It was kind of known as the big breakthrough after COVID where everyone started going back to cinemas. Anyone remember? How about I show you? Top Gun Maverick, right? So think about a soldier or a platoon that is under heavy fire and they're stuck. They're stuck. And whatever body armor and weapons they have on them, they're only going to get them so far in a situation like that. And so what is the soldier trained to do in a moment like that? To grab their radio and they call for air support. They get on their radio, they give the coordinates of where they're located and where they're needing the help, and usually in a matter of moments, those fighter jets are flying over, raining down all their firepower on the enemy, giving that soldier the time, the space, and the safety to escape. You see, if Paul were writing Ephesians today, I reckon he'd use a weapon like that to talk about prayer. Right? He would have written about the body armor of righteousness, the boots of the gospel, perhaps, I don't know, the automatic rifle of the word of God. But then finally, in verse 18, I think he would have written about the air support of prayer. In this spiritual warfare against evil, when the Christian soldier is stuck and under heavy fire, prayer is how we reach for that radio and call in for our air support. Prayer is how we call down that firepower available to us from heaven. And so now then, it's within this context of our spiritual armor and our spiritual weapons, Paul now turns his attention to prayer. And here, based on Ephesians 6, here's what I want us to notice about how Paul instructs us to use the spiritual weapon of prayer. Maybe show the next one. The next one's I forgot to remove that previous one. Here's a better graphic of those 5. Here are 5 ways for how we are to use prayer. Paul's going to say, pray at all times, pray in the Spirit, pray with all kinds of prayers, pray with alertness, and pray for one another. And like I said, I promised you a shorter sermon. You're like, that seems like a lot of points to get through in a sermon. We're just going to do number 1. Today we're just going to do number 1, and then the next 4, we'll see. That could take another 3 or 4 weeks, who knows. But the first one, let's get back into the text. Paul says, praying at all times. Number 1, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. The first way to use this spiritual weapon of prayer, Paul says simply, just use it at all times. Use it frequently. In other words, there's never an inappropriate time to pray. There's never an inappropriate time to call on our heavenly air support. Any time and at all times is a good time to call on God for help. Why? Because let's face it, any time and at all times is when our enemy is seeking to strike, isn't he? That's why Paul says to use this weapon at all times. Or another way you might put it, the way that he puts it over in the letter to Thessalonians, he says, pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. And so let's just think about that for a moment. Praying at all times, praying without ceasing. He can't possibly mean to pray without stopping ever, right? Like is Paul just using hyperbole here? How is that even possible to pray every second of every minute of every hour? And yet in Paul's mind, there does seem to be a way where we as Christian soldiers can pray at all times and without ceasing. And so I was thinking about this. Here's one suggestion of what Paul may mean by this. Here's just one suggestion. Perhaps there is a way. Perhaps there is a way for our entire day, and in fact, our entire lives, to be prayerful. And not necessarily only by using words. I mean, remember what prayer actually is in the first place. It's communion with God. It's communication with God. It's simply being in the presence of God. You see, the Bible often talks about the Christian life as being like on a walk. Our lives with Christ is walking with Christ. And so perhaps walking could be a helpful metaphor to think about when thinking about prayer. See, my wife, Maru, you'd know her, she loves going on walks. I mean, just ask, Emma, Grace, or Lyndall. They often get roped into going on walks with her all the time. But no, I have to admit, she especially loves it when I agree to go on a walk with her. And when I'm walking with my wife, our conversations tend to be numerous, but not necessarily constant. Even if there is a moment of silence, we are still together. We haven't left one another's presence. See, perhaps something like this is what Paul has in mind with praying at all times, praying without ceasing. It's to have this kind of attitude with prayer throughout the day. It's to live our lives no matter what we're doing, whether at work, home, a friend's place, at the gym, at the shops, wherever we are, whatever we're doing. But it's to live and walk with God like we're walking with a friend. The conversations will be numerous, frequent at times. But even when there isn't necessarily any verbal communication taking place, there is, however, a very real sense that we are still together. We haven't left one another's presence, not for a moment. See, think about when you are probably most vulnerable to Satan's temptations. When is it? It's usually when we're alone. But if you're living with a heightened awareness of God's presence in your life, a conscious awareness that He is right there with you at all times, well, that's what someone like, I don't know if you've ever read his book, Brother Lawrence. That's what Brother Lawrence called in his book, practicing the presence of God. Practicing the presence of God. And when you're practicing the presence of God, you are naturally then putting yourself in the path of the power of God. I know that many of you have experienced, you know what I'm talking about. When you're in the presence of God, experiencing the power of God in such a way that desire to please God and to therefore not sin against my God, it trumps. It overpowers. It takes precedent over the desires that you may have to please the flesh and to give in to temptation. And there's a classic example in the Old Testament that came to mind as I thought about this. To practice the presence of God and be in the path of the power of God, therefore. It's Joseph. Remember Joseph and Potiphar's wife? Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Joseph was facing those fiery darts of temptation day after day. Request after request from Potiphar's wife to sleep with her. And yet, do you remember what kept him from giving in? He believed that God was with him at all times. And notice the words that come out of his mouth when facing temptation, the words that come out of someone who knows that God is with them at all times. He says, "How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" That's a man of prayer. That's a man who practiced the presence of God and knew the power of God in his life. But now on the flip side, if Joseph had chosen to walk alone, if Joseph had chosen to ignore God for most of the day, attempting to face the enemy in his own strength, well then I dare say his story wouldn't have ended like it ended. It wouldn't have ended well. We probably wouldn't be using Joseph as a real life example, a real human, right? A young man with desires just like all of us, but who chose to live as though he never left the Lord's presence, not for a moment. Here's another image that came to mind as I was thinking on this idea of praying at all times as a way of calling in for air support. Anyone know what one of these buttons? You've seen one of these buttons before? It's one of these SOS buttons that are often given to the elderly as a way of being able to call for help at any time, literally at the push of a button. And the goal of carrying that button so close to them, usually around the neck, is to allow them to live with a sense of security, safety, and peace, knowing that help is available to them at whatever time and wherever they are. Perhaps we can start seeing Paul's instruction to pray at all times as kind of like carrying that SOS button around our necks. Because when we are practicing the presence of God, well, then we too can face the struggles and temptations of life with a sense of security, safety, and peace, knowing that help is available to us at whatever time, whatever we might be going through. But at the press of a button, not at the press of a button, but perhaps with just a simple cry for help. And like the Apostle John wrote, if we know that he hears us, which we know he does, well, then we have the confidence that he's there to offer whatever help we are needing in that moment. So now then, you might be wondering, well, how can I do this? How can I do this? How does one even practice the presence of God? Well, I don't think it's difficult, and I reckon most of you are doing it already. It's just small, intentional actions, thoughts, prayers as I go about my day, but that are helping me to develop the habit of being in a constant state of communion and communication with God. Perhaps small little intentional triggers that remind me that God is with me at all times. For some, playing some worship music on their commute to work helps them maintain a spirit of prayer. Perhaps you're at work or at school, knowing that you're about to see someone that you don't like very much. You know, you could even use that to be a trigger for prayer. God, you know more than anyone how I feel about this person, so please help me to love them or bless them in a way that just doesn't come naturally to me. Even something like that could be a trigger for prayer. You see, practicing the presence of God can even be done with the mundane, ordinary chores and tasks in our lives. You might be washing the dishes, cleaning the house, walking the dog, getting the groceries, doing your homework, scrolling on the internet, spending time with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, whatever you choose to do. You might think about intentionally, remember last week, the sword of the Spirit? You might choose to intentionally bring words of Scripture to mind. Like 1 Corinthians 10:31, one of my favorite scriptures that for me is a trigger to pray at all times. A verse that says that whatever you do, whether it's eating, whether it's drinking, whether it's cooking or talking or homework or watching, do it all, Paul says, in a way that honors God and is pleasing to God. Why? Why would we do such a thing? Well, because he is right there with you, with me, as you do every one of those things. I think the challenge for this morning couldn't be more basic than that. Not simple. This isn't easy. Otherwise, we'd all be doing it all the time. But one basic way that you could be praying at all times and learning to practice the presence of God and learning to consider him and his desires before doing anything. Here's one practical tip. What if we were to just pause before doing anything we're about to do? Now it sounds unrealistic, fanatical. What if we were to just pause before doing anything we're about to do? and just send up a quick, simple prayer asking, God, does this honor you? Does this please you? You see, I reckon if we did only that more often, well, then there's a far greater probability that, like Joseph, we'd make it through Satan's fiery attacks. We'd make it through Satan's temptations unscathed. We'd make it through to the other side, being able to say like Joseph did, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So that's the first way to use this spiritual weapon of prayer. Paul says to use it at all times, often, frequently, by practicing the presence of God in our lives. Living with peace and security that He is there to rescue us. Not at the press of a button, but at the simple cry for help through a prayer. And like I promised, we're just covering that first point. If you're keen to hear the next 4, please come back next week as we continue to discover how Paul wants us to use this secret weapon of prayer. As a